Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 4 of my new series, Beyond the Bible, where we are looking at all Christian work that is found outside of the Protestant Canon. We are starting with the Apocrypha, and this is book 4, known as the Wisdom of Solomon, or also sometimes known as the Book of Wisdom. It's also very similar and very different than what we see with the traditional wisdom literature that is associated to Solomon in the Hebrew Bible. So let's dive in. Point 1 is Canon Controversy, and it's getting redundant, so watch episodes 1, 2, and 3 if you really want to know the main reasons that things get dropped. I want to talk about what's specific to this book, The Wisdom of Solomon. And it's just beyond clear when it's written. That's our main issue. So we know that it's not Solomon who is the author, and that was a big deal for the reformers. Because this isn't just an extra book that we can tie something into. This is a claimed book of Solomon that competes with and contradicts much of the ideas that we get from books like Proverbs or Ecclesiastes. It just doesn't jive. One of the main things being the afterlife and the immortality of the soul, which was simply not of the same Jewish thought at that time. Of course, also helping this case is the fact that it was written in Greek, that we have no Aramaic or Hebrew origins or manuscripts. We already compared it with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, but even unlike other wisdom literature like Psalms or sometimes Isaiah is considered, these aren't Hebrew themes and ideas. These are Greek, especially Platonism and Stoicism that seem to be on display in this text, which is kind of funny because one of the main things that's rejected here is the personification of wisdom, but we already had that in Proverbs with Lady Wisdom. It gets a higher status here, this quasi-divine entity, instead of just a representation of wisdom. That felt a little too similar to the whole concept of the Logos, which, yeah, we see that in John, but at least John ties the Logos into what? Straight into Jesus. And so Luther feared doctrinal confusion. Other than the emphasis of the immortality of the soul, which was problematic for a few reasons, another was where death came from. And here, death is portrayed as a consequence of the devil's envy. Also, we have accounts of purgatory here and intercessions, meaning prayers made for those after dead, which a no-go for the Protestants. So I think we can move on. Let's get into point 2 where we set the stage. We're going to talk about authorship, context, and date. Scholars generally agree that this was written somewhere between 50 BCE and 50 CE under that Roman influence in the Mediterranean, and they've even gone as far as to say it was most likely written in Alexandria, which is in Egypt, a major cultural and intellectual hub during this Hellenistic period. Alexandria at this time would have had a large and very popular and influential Jewish community. This poor people group was stuck between the ancestral traditions and the assimilation into Greek culture. Thus, you get books like this, because of course this Jewish community was so influenced by the Greeks. I mean, this is Alexandria. You've all heard about the Library of Alexandria, a place of intellectual vibrancy. This is where it was happening. You had philosophers debating here. You still had Egyptian mysticism, but these new Stoic and Platonic ideas, as well as traditional Jewish thought, and it's all intersecting. What a unique time and place in history. I really do find it absolutely fascinating, and this is what it produces. It's trying to hold on to the roots. It's doing this pseudepigraphical work, attributing this to Solomon when it clearly isn't, trying to match up with ancient Jewish wisdom literature, but bringing in these new Hellenistic influences and ideas, mashing it all together to create a piece of wisdom literature that is unique, that shows the thoughts on wisdom in this time and place. How cool. But enough of that. Let's move into point 3, book overview, where we're going to break down these 19 chapters into 3 segments. Segment 1 will be the first 5 chapters. We'll call this the righteous versus the wicked. This is our introduction to the book of wisdom, where we're really separating the righteous from the unrighteous. Righteousness leads to immortality, but wickedness is self-destruction. So we're getting closer to the heaven-hell concept, not quite all the way fleshed out. Right away, Wisdom 115. Wisdom is typically how this book is referred to, not Wisdom of Solomon 115 when you're quoting it. So Wisdom 115 really sets the stage for us by simply saying righteousness is immortal. This is the key connection. This is everything. Wisdom 3:1 goes a little further, planting those seeds for heaven and hell. The souls of the righteous are in the hand of God. And what? No torment will ever touch them. It's an assurance that those who obey, those who follow the rules, who are righteous, they'll be protected. Sometimes the book is really beautiful and there's some really neat insight, and sometimes it is just so reductive back to fear God and obey his commands, which is essentially what the Bible wraps up to in general. Or else. We do get some neat tricks here. We get a perspective from the unrighteous. This happens in Wisdom 2, and it's kind of calling out hedonism of the time, where the unrighteous believe that nothing happens when you die, that life is short and sorrowful and ultimately meaningless, so they live it up. It's critiquing the mindset of those who believe there's nothing beyond death. We have to remember to instill fear of punishment afterwards and reward of pleasure afterwards so that you will behave now the way we want you to. Not that I agree with pure hedonism, but this battle between religion critiquing hedonism as its worst possible case, getting mad that people are living for now, recognizing the only life they have. Don't they know about the horrible things God will do to them? Don't they know about the good things he could do for them if they just what? Essentially sacrifice this life now. So there's a denial of judgment from the wicked here, and then you have the righteous coming in and telling them better. The conversation happens about eternal consequence, and of course moves forward to the vindication of the righteous. We see that in Wisdom 5, 1-5, where we envision a final judgment where both the wicked and the righteous are being rewarded or punished accordingly. And it wouldn't be connected to the Christian idea in some capacity if it didn't have this amazing end scene where the wicked regret their ways, they come to know better, they were wrong, and the people they once mocked are now receiving divine honor. It's all spelled out in this first 5 chapters. It's just, at this point, maybe not everyone else sees it this way, it's just such a trope. If you go through the first 66 books of the Protestant canon, you have all this same kind of stuff, and you begin, when you see it outside of it, but still included within Christian ideas, it begins to become so clear. This is just a problem with death and with fairness. So the people that don't have it good in this life, they put on themselves this slave mentality. They envision for themselves this amazing, perfect, blissful state where not only will things get better for them, but where they will get to witness the destruction and judgment of the people who are living differently or better or more sinful than them now. They will get the final, aha, I told you so. They will see the regret. They will win in the end. It's a coping story for the actualities of the unfairness and suffering of life. But let's get some wisdom. Let's move on to the wisdom of Solomon. This is segment 2. This is going to be in chapters 6-9. This segment shifts to a much more personal tone, adopting the voice of Solomon as he reflects on the value of wisdom. It's not merely some intellectual pursuit like those heathen Greek philosophers think. It again actually leads to righteousness, which actually leads to eternal reward, to not dying. A couple important passages for you might be Wisdom 7:7, which is funny. I prayed and understanding was given to me. I called on God and the spirit of wisdom came to me. Not acquired through human effort alone. You'll see as we go on, this just becomes a critique of modern philosophy at that time. This is God-given. Only God can give this. Also, Wisdom 7:22-30 describes wisdom as the pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Again, this personified force that guides it. So we're going to again see Solomon's request for wisdom, and he just wants it so he can govern his people wisely. We are acknowledging, even as a king, human status is not enough to do well. You must get your wisdom from God if you're going to succeed. If we back up a little bit, actually, we'll see wisdom's role in creation. Now, this is where things started to get a little dicey for the reformers. If you look at Wisdom 7:24-27, the text claims that wisdom is present in all things and is a reflection of God's power. Wisdom is depicted as the force that orders the cosmos. We're starting to align the Greek idea of the logos there, and it almost gets into this at times in the book, nature worship, but not in a condemning way. Just you need to understand the transitive property of this. We see the beauty, the amazement in creation. We just back up one step to the creator of that. And thus, in appreciating creation, we appreciate and worship the creator. And wisdom is mixed in there and kind of ebbing and flowing. It's a really interesting thing to look at and deserves a little more attention than I'm going to give it right now. Just want to cover that as a highlighted feature. And then, of course, we have to have Solomon declaring how important wisdom is, specifically over anything else, including power. So he's going to list things that he prefers wisdom over, like scepters, thrones, and even gold. Wisdom is true prosperity, equating these other things with false prosperity, a demonization of those who consider those things prosperous in the here and now, the heathens that don't believe in the afterlife. But let's move on to our last segment. Covers a lot of room here, but it really does all wrap up into divine intervention. So it's going to be chapters 10 through 19. We're going to go on a little stroll through history. And we're going to place wisdom right at the heart of all of these events, specifically talking about the Exodus, but we go through some of the other biblical historical events. And we see that wisdom was there all along. That was the divine intervention. It was wisdom. This is the great power source. So Wisdom 10:4 says, when the earth was flooded because of him, wisdom again saved it, steering the righteous man by paltry pieces of wood. So, even though God regretted creating man and wipes them all out, wisdom was the one guiding the rest. Is there some other entity up there? How far do we take this personification? Is it just an extension of God's nature? That's how it's often described. Or is there really a Lady Wisdom, kind of like an early version of the Holy Spirit here, moving and directing things in a different way? God in his wrathful, justful anger destroys, but wisdom preserves and creates. It's very interesting how different sects of Christians over different time periods have taken and interpreted this. In Wisdom 10:15, it is wisdom that gets credit for delivering the Israelites out of captivity during the Exodus. In Wisdom 16, we see a nice, unique twist from the author when recounting the events of the plagues during the Exodus. And the plagues are portrayed as opportunities for the Egyptians to recognize God's power and repent. We see this a little bit even in the original Exodus story where God is bragging to Moses about how he will harden Pharaoh's heart, do all these amazing, powerful, horrific things so that what? So that all of Egypt will recognize God, which doesn't happen. Just God failing with his knowledge again, which, by the way, is Sunday's episode. We're going to be talking about God's omniscience and all the problems with it. So be sure to check that out. Just wrapping up what the Book of Wisdom is, it really all does boil down to, hey, wisdom is fear, because all the times that people properly feared God, that's what all these historical allusions are. They were spared or they were protected. And when people didn't properly fear this God, they didn't believe in his power, they didn't respect his authority, well, they were wiped out and destroyed. So, what is wisdom? Wisdom is fear of God. That's pretty much how we wrapped up all of the wisdom literature when I went through those books in Secular Bible Study series. Specifically, check out these 3 videos here. And before we move on to point 4, let me just read you a couple other key verses. Wisdom 2:23 through 24 is pretty theologically important here. For God created man for incorruption and made him in the image of his own eternity. But through the envy of the devil, death entered the world, and those who belong to his party experience it. A lot of work is being done in this passage. Wisdom 7:22 through 23 paints this picture. For in her there is a spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible, beneficent, humane, steadfast, sure, free from anxiety, all-powerful, overseeing all, and penetrating through all spirits that are intelligent, pure, and most subtle. This is the poetic description of wisdom personified. Wisdom is not just an attribute. This is active. This is divine. So let's move on to point 4, a literary analysis. What a unique combination for genre. Let's see, it's wisdom literature, it's poetry for sure, and also philosophy, philosophical discourse, that is. When it comes to style, it's notable for its sophisticated Greek language, another dead giveaway about the time in which this was written. A lot of rhetorical techniques, a lot of literary devices here, such as rhetorical questions, antithesis, parallels, repetition, this Jewish Hellenistic synthesis. Anytime that you're combining 2 radically different cultures to essentially update what is looking awfully antiquated, but not able to fully commit to the new, this is kind of the middle ground you get. A lot of use of symbolism and a lot of philosophical influences, which isn't unique, by the way. We see that throughout a lot of the New Testament. Paul is echoing so much Stoicism, just mixing in a little bit of new Christian theology is all. We had the parallelism with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which is interesting. We had all of the historical allusions, biblical allusions, and allegory. So again, again, I just think it's a neat piece of writing, very unique. And when you understand all this context and influence and what it was trying to accomplish, I think you just appreciate it more, even if you disagree with it. And even if you think that some of the parts are really silly and reductive. So what are our main themes? What are we supposed to glean from this? Well, I would say first is that wisdom is divine. It's not something you gain through practice and hard work and philosophy. It's divine and eternal. Two, I think we are describing further and encouraging more thought on immortality and the afterlife. I mean, this book is beating into you how important the eternal rewards are, how awful the eternal consequence. And that may seem not like a big deal when you're so familiar with the New Testament, but for what this is adding on to of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, this is a big deal. And then it wouldn't be a book of any kind of Bible if it didn't have its main theme also being justice/divine retribution. Just painting that very clear picture in the first 5 chapters of the woeful, regretful, incorrect hedonist getting theirs, while the dutiful, sacrificial, righteous person inherits all the glory. So let's move on, if we haven't already covered them, with any problematic passages here. First, I think we have what is almost hard to believe is in here. Wisdom 1:13. God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. Now, we see this kind of apologetic all the time. I usually find it so ridiculous because clearly, again, I say this all the time, and I got it from someone else, but if God is 100% sovereign, he's 100% responsible. He didn't make death? Did we just lose God's omnipotence? And if something so severe, death, can come about without coming from God, did he not know about it with his foreknowledge? So now we're losing another attribute. But if he did know about it and he still chose to create anyways, then again, he's ultimately responsible for death. Can't get away from it. You can play semantic games with, well, he didn't make it, but it came about and he allowed it. Well, whatever. This is how simple it is. If you believe your God is all powerful, if he didn't want something, his hands weren't tied. No one forced him to create or allow death. What a silly verse. And as for not delighting in it, tell that to the rest of the Bible. See this video. Honestly, it's one of my favorite ones that I've done because it highlights the pure insanity. Christians have all of these copes. They have all of these excuses for God had to do what he had to do. He didn't want to. He doesn't delight in this stuff. No, he delights in destruction. It's just a bunch of verses from the Bible that prove that. I don't know where people are getting this or how anyone can put anything like this into a book about this same Yahweh. Wisdom 2:24 says, but by the envy of the devil, death entered the world. So again, now we're getting the apologetic for where death came from. And this actually does a lot more work than a lot of the Protestant Bible does for making the devil the true enemy. Even when he kills children in Job, it's only after he gets the allowance from God to do so. And that, again, is actually more the accuser, the Satan, different than the devil we get of the New Testament, which this is much closer to. That devil is on the prowl, seeing who he can tempt and stray away, sure, but now he's the inventor of death. His sin alone was so great, even though he was in heaven, you can't sin in heaven. His sin alone was so great that it created something that God never intended. Again, going back to a verse we read earlier, God's intention for those created in his image was immortality. It gets interrupted with this invention of the devil, death, and thus God has to find a way back to give eternal life. And in this book, it's just righteousness, which you attain through wisdom. Wisdom 12:10 is interesting because the text claims that God gives patience, that he has patience rather, with sinners, allowing them time to repent. First of all, it's just not what we see in the Bible. We see God often act very swiftly with immediate retribution and destruction. Second, it's vague, which makes it not helpful. It's open-ended for an apologetic that everyone had a chance. Well, how long is he giving them? What new information is he giving them in the meantime? It's just an inconsistent and kind of immeasurable, useless tool that provides nothing but, again, a vague apologetic for placing the onus back on the individual instead of giving God the responsibility for his wrath. Wisdom 3:4-6 talks about the righteous are disciplined a little, but overall rewarded, right? Again, We just have a book that is already working on an apologetic level saying, yeah, I mean, life isn't great here. It's not always fair, but it's worth it in the end. Just wait for heaven. And it minimizes suffering. It minimizes the reality of how people live and have lived and the lives they've been receivers of, that they had no control over their circumstances and the horrors that happened to them. And it's simply not true. Even biblically, look at Job. Job's a righteous man and he suffered immensely. It wasn't minimal. It was a full-on attack that God compensated him for. But come on, all that goes to do is show how little God thinks of what a father is supposed to feel for his children. They're replaceable. Again, how small. While we're sticking on this weird adaptations to common apologetics, we can look at Wisdom 4:7 through 14. It suggests here that sometimes God takes people away early to prevent them from falling into sin. So God is now ending life prematurely for the sake of moral perfection. How is that fair? How does he decide who he'll do that for? Well, I mean, what this is suggesting is that with God's perfect foreknowledge, he knows some people, if given the time, would fall into sin, fall away from him, and thus have to be punished. So he's killing them early. Favoritism, predestination, selection, call it whatever you want. It's not just. Why not do this for everyone? This is the why not heaven now argument. If you know that you're going to create people who are going to fall, that you'll then have to punish, never do it in the first place. That's what God is okay with here. I'll just let them live a little bit while everything's still good. And then what does that say about original sin? Like theologically, this is so messed up. But here it is. And again, this is in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. Like a great percentage of Christians believe this. Issue. And let's end with that one. There's plenty, though. This book is making a lot of claims that are pretty wild and pretty hard to align with, again, a nature of a perfect, loving, just being, or also what we see in the rest of other parts of the Bible. So thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Again, look forward to the Sunday video. I'm excited to share that one with you. And until then, keep thinking. I'd like to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, Christy, and Thronus, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.